everyone, and welcome to the Building Regulation series. This is the episode on fire safety. We are now into the Q&A. I'm going to jump straight in. Thank you, everyone, for putting your questions into the Q&A, and thank you for upvoting as well. It really helps me work out which question is really important. So 11 people have upvoted this question from Robert Williams. The principal designer must monitor the design phase to ensure the products and materials specified by designers will be used within their certified parameters and therefore perform as expected in the event of fire. Does the PD therefore need the same level of qualifications as the fire engineer or others? How can the PD be comfortable with that statement if they do not completely understand the specific of the products and materials as the specialist designer would?
I think it sort of plays to the conversation that we've been having generally about the PD under building regulations, but this idea that the principal designer, in most cases now, with what needs to be done, can rarely be an individual. This becomes, in a complex building, it's an organizational role, and it requires different levels of, and if you are acting in an individual capacity, then it's a conversation with the client saying this building is really complex. We certainly need a fire engineer, and that fire engineer needs to be engaged in both the capacity as final design, but also in the capacity of design process. So it's a conversation. It's moving this on a bit to say this is not just about the final building, but it's also about how you design it along the way. And if that requires two fire engineers, so be it. Andrew.
Yeah, I used to work with fire engineers on projects. You don't need to be a fire engineer to understand the principles of what they're saying. I used to create other documents for the principal contractor based on fire risk assessment produced by the fire engineer, so that what we were talking about earlier, the sequencing of events, could be addressed by the principal contractor as part of the review of the construction phase plan. So the basic answer to your question is everybody doesn't have to have the same level of knowledge, understanding, and competence, but you need to know what the fundamentals are, what to look for, and if you don't know, who to ask.
Thank you ever so much. Fergus asks, would you expect the CDM PD to be seeking assurances from the contractor that his compounded material storage were low fire risk, or actively directing them?
The location of the compound is usually part of the general consideration of site layout, proximity to building, proximity to storage of flammable materials, and so on and so forth. So yes, it would be a consideration in terms of the overall safety related to the site layout.
I would turn the question round, is if you thought that was a relevant factor, then that includes in the pre-construction fire risk assessment that says due to the proximity of the compound, it needs to be this.
Yeah.
Yeah. We used to keep the cabins significantly far away from scaffolding when we were doing overcladding work. And, I think, as Mark says, it's just one of the considerations. If there's a fire risk and it could be stored materials that create the fire risk, you have to address that.
Thank you. Alethea, how do you ensure durability of the fire retardant treatment that has been used on timber frame components? Putting this into the context of construction sites that are left unattended for a long period of time for a number of reasons, for example, resources, program, client decisions.
There is a very clear process within the STA, Structured Timber Association guidelines. There's 16 steps, and there's also the guidance on separating distances. There is an expectation that you follow that process, and that process will lead you to a number of conclusions if you follow that process, and then that information then gets handed to the contractor. It's really important if you have a timber frame that you follow that guidance, because it is de facto the standard to follow.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Satish asks, our clients choose the materials used in the construction, and as a PD, do we need to seek confirmation from the client that materials selected are fire resistant and include any risks that we foresee from using these materials in build in PCI documentation?
You have a responsibility relating to those materials, so it's you need to engage with your client about the selection of materials. And I get the sense of what's been said is that we work in this world where the contractor does what they do and says, what's it got to do with you? And the client does what they're doing and saying, what's it got to do with you? But it's got, as 168 says, it's got everything to do with the principal designer under CDM, and even more to do with the principal designer under building regulations, or not more to do, but in different phases. The industry needs to wake up to this. This is where we're moving to, and there's a good reason.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for your lovely words that you're putting in. Obviously, if you do need to go, that's completely understandable. It's the reason we do record the Q&A separately. It will be on YouTube in the next 2 days. Sally asks, a lot of the time the CDM PD is appointed after the design has been approved and PC has started on site. How can all this realistically be put in place? I currently work for a PC, soon to be moving into the PDA role with an architectural practice / building surveying consultancy. I hardly ever see a PD coming to site in my current role. The PD appears to provide PCI and nothing more. Hopefully I can change this. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Hopefully you can change it, is my thought, and it should change. Because as you'll have seen from these slides in particular, there is a very significant need for the principal designer CDM and the principal designer building regulations to be involved closely with the principal contractor, particularly in relation to fire risk, but in relation to all other matters relating to safety. That's safe construction and safety in use.
It's been a complete passion of mine. The reason I sit here as president is that I want the industry to understand that a PD under CDM needs to be good. They need to be competent, and that's quite a high level bar. And I want the industry to understand that they should go out and find those people, because those people will deliver what needs to be delivered. And we need to change this where people are doing it for a little bit of extra fee, having done a 1 week safety course. It's not about that. And you look at the complexity, fire safety alone, the amount of training to get competent, the amount of knowledge you have to have of the industry just to cover your fire safety duties, let alone temporary works, let alone the multitude of other things you need to know about. And the only way we're going to change this is if we drive competence and drive that message to the industry and get the industry to select good people, and only select good people because they understand that matters.
Thank you ever so much. Myra has given us a link, and I'm going to pass that to yourselves just to make sure, and we'll send that out in the follow-up email. So thank you ever so much for that, Myra. Karen asks, can you please give your thoughts on works within existing buildings, whereas built information is not always going to be available, and where historic elements are valued for retention?
Well, I'm working on an existing HRB at the minute, and the initial fire risk assessor says rip out all the doors, and these are beautiful double height timber doors, absolutely stunning, and listed buildings, and probably more significantly, the residents said you can't do that to our building. It's not as simple as that. And so, at my recommendation, they've called in a fire engineer and said, look, we've got this problem. We don't want to get rid of these doors. What else can we do? What difference can we do? And they're working through that process. They've done smoke modeling. They've done and proved that there is a problem that needs to be managed. That was the first thing. Is do these doors really matter? Yes, they do. What can we do differently? And they've come up with a strategy that allows them to do some different stuff to respect the timber frame building. You need to think about this differently. that's where you move into fire engineering. Fire engineering doesn't follow. I don't want to say it doesn't follow rules. It goes back to first principles and comes up with solutions.
Thank you ever so much. Michael asks, what is the application method / route for works which affect the fire safety measures of an existing building, but that do not require building regulations approval?
Can you say that to me again, Tommy?
Of course I can. What I'm in my webinar voice. What is the application method / route for works which affect the fire safety measures of an existing building, but that do not require building regulations approval?
I gave you a clue to some of the issues just now when I talked about fire risk assessment. Fire risk assessment under the fire safety order requires you to consider risk. If there is a risk that justifies action to be taken, or if you are taking action to deal with a fire safety issue, then there is a hierarchy of controls. That hierarchy of controls requires you to adapt to technical progress. Technical progress is identified in Schedule 1 of the building regulations and approved documents and the British standards as relevant. So you need to comply if you are doing something to mitigate a risk. If you're doing it for any other reason, it needs to comply with the building regulations. There's more to that question that Andrew and I are having a discussion, and we will have an answer to it next week, because I've done a little bit of research yesterday, and I'm in reading what I've read, I've completely and utterly confused myself because I just can't work out the answer to the question. But that's relating to when does the building regulations apply relating to fire safety, change of fire safety features. And I'm reading the stuff I've done. There's some very learned papers that seem to confuse the matter even. So we're going to take some high level advice and try to get a definitive answer for you.
I mean, as always, Mark, if you're struggling, I'll have a look at it. I'll see what I can. More than happy to. More than happy to.
Well, if Andrew doesn't know it and I don't know it, then we know somebody who does, and neither of us do know the answer at the minute.
I've read a few books and watched a bit of YouTube. I know what I'm doing. Donald asks, building regulations and CDM regulations require an appointment of a PD. How does this relate to current use of BRPD and CDM PD?
I'm not clear what the question is there.
That's okay. Donald, if you're still in the group, would you mind just giving us your question again? Maybe adding a bit more to it. We can see if we're going to give you a hand there. Eggleston asks, dual construction projects require appointment of PDBR or only for high-risk buildings?
Well, the PDBR is appointed to all projects where building control is required.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much. Savagnanam asks, who has the final say on sequencing the projects and determining its viability?
Well, it's a joint effort, really, isn't it? When I used to do design work, I quite often thought about the sequence of events. And that would be for practical reasons, for safety reasons, etc., etc. And so my thoughts on that would go into the PCI and be given to the contractor, who then had the designer's thoughts in front of them. What would then happen is the contractor would think, well, I can do it that way, or I can come up with an alternative. And then what you would do is discuss the two methodologies together, decide which was the most advantageous relating to safety. And obviously, you'd have to take costs into account to some extent, but you'd come to an agreement about safe sequencing.
Thank you ever so much. And that was our final question. So thank you everyone for coming today. I'm going to end it there.